Sure. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our judge adaptation lecture. My name is Kelly. And if you have any questions, you can email me at the email address, or you can message me on Slack if you are participating in the Beyond Resolved workshop.
Hi, I'm Sharan, and you can also email me at this email address or message me on Slack. So today we're going to talk about judge adaptation and things you can do for each type of judge. We'll start by talking about some general tips. We'll talk about what judges look for, what kinds of judges exist, and how to adapt to them if you're on a panel.
Okay, so starting off with section 1, we'll just talk about like what you should generally always be doing in a round, regardless of what type of judge you have. So the overall like theme for this section, or like a lot of the lecture, will be that judge adaptation is about more than just going fast or slow. It's about more than changing round to round. It's about understanding how to communicate, because in each round you're trying to effectively communicate to the judge why they should vote for you. And this happens in each round, regardless of whether or not you're debating in front of a lay, flay, or flow judge. So the first aspect of this is like being understandable to each type of judge. So I think this is a really important lesson, because a lot of students think that adaptation is just like dumbing down arguments and being condescending in front of lay judges, because like they like don't understand like flow debate or something. So that lends itself to like, it's not really adaptation in that sense, because you're just like being rude to your judge. So this also leads to a few different problems. It leads to dismissing RFGs as irrelevant from a lay judge, because they're like, oh, well, they're just a lay judge. Like, they obviously didn't understand debate, when this is in reality, your inability to win the ballot from the lay judge also can be an inability to take responsibility for mistakes made in the round. So maybe you didn't like slow down enough. Maybe you were spreading it in front of a lay judge. Obviously, that's your fault, and students need to be able to take responsibility for their actions that may or may not have led a lay judge to drop them. Obviously, there will be rounds where like the decision may just seem completely random, and that might be out of your control, but there are certainly rounds in which you can adapt effectively and not be condescending or rude to a lay judge or even like a flay judge. So adapting to a judge is not just about like superficial changes, like, I don't know, like how you speak, like how you talk, stuff like that. It's also about helping the judge understand your side / your arguments. And this is really important, because a lot of the time judges won't do the work to make you understandable to them. Like, even a flow judge, like if you don't extend something properly, we're not going to do the work for you and be like, oh, well, they meant this. Or if you extend, or if you like didn't extend something, then they're like, oh, like they might have meant to do that. We're not going to do that for you. So overwhelmingly, you need to be understandable to your judge, regardless of who they are, and effectively adapt to them, but also take responsibility for mistakes that you make. So now we're going to talk about how we can make the round understandable. And this is true for all judges. So the first one is that you need to be implicating responses. So a lot of the times I will hear people just like read responses, and they don't necessarily like explain what these responses mean. They'll just be responses on the flow. So this is really important, because like you should probably be telling your judge why you're spending like 30 seconds explaining something, because if you don't explain what it means to me, I'm not going to take the time to figure out what it means. And this is especially also true for a lay judge. This is also really important in the sense that it helps you form round narrative, because it allows the judge to follow along with the debate more clearly and how everything fits together. Because in your mind, you are extending something for a reason, and it makes sense why you're extending it. But if you don't explain to the judge why you're doing it, they're probably not going to catch on to it, because they're not you and they're not debating your position. They're judging, and that's completely different from debating in a round. The other thing is that you can adapt when the other team isn't. So if you're in front of a lay judge and the other team is like spreading or like just like dumping cards and not explaining anything, then you can adapt effectively by grouping responses. So like you can deal with card dumps, you can do big picture analysis, but most importantly, like you just want to make sure that you're catering to the lay judge, because regardless of like who is debating, the most important person in the round is the judge, because they're deciding who wins. The next one is like for tech judges, like you do like line by line, like calling out drops, like just like your usual things that you like good, or not like good debate, but like usual things that you associate with a tech judge. So make sure that you adapt when the other team isn't, because it'll make your path to the ballot a lot easier. And then the final thing is that you should always be accessible. So this kind of goes hand in hand with being understandable. And accessibility is kind of the idea that like everyone in the round can participate, including your judge. And this makes the round a lot more fun because the judge isn't like just like watching two people screaming at each other now. It's like the judge being able to actively participate in the round and understand what is happening. Not like participate in the sense that they're like, doing anything, but they're actively present in the round. So being more accessible often is like avoiding jargon in rounds when you know the judge is not experienced with debate. So like don't yell like uniqueness. What is it? Uniqueness controls the link or whatever. I don't even know. Like I don't know what that means. Like a lay judge definitely won't know what that means. So don't like use a lot of jargon when you know that they are a lay judge. The other thing is that you can use ballot directive language, which means that like you are using very explicit language on what the judge should do with their ballot. So like you can sign your ballot here because blah blah blah, or like circle this on your flow because it's important because blah blah blah. That's really helpful when we're judging. The last thing, or second to last thing, is warranting your arguments, like just like explaining what you mean, because there will be a lot of judges who haven't debated this topic for like a month or have done research on it, and a lot of people forget that. The last thing is doing comparative analysis, which we'll get more into later, but basically actually comparing the two sides directly to each other as opposed to just like debating on both sides of the flow. And then last thing is how can you tell if you're adapting? So before the round, first impressions are really important. Like the moment you walk into a round, like your judge is probably watching you. This is really true for a lay judge or like a parent or a less experienced person. Sometimes for flow judges, they don't like really care. But regardless, your first impression really matters. The way that you carry yourself, the way that you conduct yourself is super important. Like if you're doing things and your judge is making faces, if your judge is making faces at you like before the round, you should probably stop doing whatever you're doing. Also, make sure you read paradigms. Sharan will get into that later, but this is really important if you want to make sure that you're adapting correctly. And then in the round, in terms of like figuring out whether or not you're adapting to them well, like the first question I always ask myself, are they flowing? If they're not flowing, they're probably a lay judge, and I probably would have determined that before the round. But if they're not flowing, you might also be going too fast. Like if they set their pen down, that's probably not good for you. The other question is, how are they flowing? Maybe they'll tell you that they're a flow judge, but they're flowing on like index cards or like on one sheet of paper. That probably indicates to you that they're not that experienced. The other question is, are they still flowing? Like if you're in the middle of a speech and you notice they just put their pen down, that probably means you're going too fast. You're not being understandable. Make sure you can adapt within a speech too. The last thing is, how are they reacting to what I say or do? So like if they're like making faces while you're, I don't know, like dumping 10 diss ads, then like you probably shouldn't be doing that. They probably don't like that. If you are like in crossfire and they look very uncomfortable, you should probably think about what your behavior is. These are all things that you can pick up on in a round to determine how well you are adapting and adjust accordingly. Okay, so the second thing that we'll talk about is the round through the judge's perspective. So we're going to talk about how do judges evaluate a round, because I think that a lot of students make the assumption that judges see the round the same way that like they see the round, but that's definitely not true, and judging is a very unique experience. So the overarching theme of this round, or of this section, is that from the judge's perspective, the entire round can be seen as the process of developing a ballot for the affirmative or the negative and choosing between these two ballots. And this is going to be really important because a lot of people just think that like the most important thing in a round is to win their arguments and then they're golden, but that's not quite it. So the first thing we'll talk about is how can you make a round easier for a judge? And going off of what I just said, you should be spending the round like developing your ballot and then presenting it to your judge in final focus. So summary and final focus, as I just alluded to, is not really about just proving and winning your arguments, because the other team can also prove and win their arguments. It's more about giving the judge a reason to prefer your ballot over the other teams and actually justifying that reason. And this is because there's rarely rounds where you are just outright winning everything and you're just like, this is an absolute win, just like vote for us on this. And you need to kind of acknowledge that there's the possibility that you might lose this round, or you are behind on some things, to actually like develop a ballot that is conducive to what the judge wants to do. Because from our perspective, we will know that you're probably not winning everything on your case, or we will know that you didn't do a complete extension and summary. And if you just go up there in final focus, you're like, we win our argument, like blah, 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 blah. That doesn't make us feel comfortable voting for you, because we know you didn't actually win the argument. We want to feel safe in our decisions, and we want to be able to justify to other people who are watching, because there will be spectators and there will be questions if like we make a decision that seems to be a little bit odd. So next we'll talk about how can you make judging easier. So the first one, which I already alluded to, is don't assume a totality of circumstances because you're rarely going to be winning everything or winning your argument perfectly. So if you see that you're not winning something, the judge definitely sees that too, and that's something that you like need to kind of acknowledge. And I'll get back to, and I'll get to that in a second about what that means. So moving on, like being realistic is really important because it makes it a lot easier to vote for you. So for instance, like if you say that you're completely winning your argument, but your opponent gets up there and says that they only have a risk of winning their argument, but this risk outweighs for like X, Y, and Z reason, the judge probably feels more comfortable voting for your opponent because that's actually how the round went down, and that's how they saw the round too. Because you didn't actually win everything on your vote, even though you say you did. And this is an example of comparative ballots because the other team is doing the direct comparison between, even if like you win your whole argument, but they say there's a risk of winning their argument that is more important for like X, Y, and Z reasons, they're doing direct comparison between the two ballots and presenting to the judge why it is like more realistic and also better to vote for them. And again, to reiterate, this is really important because judges want to feel comfortable in their decisions. Like a lot of the time you will walk out of rounds and be like, I won this argument 100%, that means I win the round. But then the RFD will be like, oh, well, I didn't think you did that enough work on it. It wasn't sufficient. Like the other team did blah, blah, blah better. So these are all things to take into consideration when you are in a round. Then we'll talk about like comparative ballots and what you can do better. So the first one, if you want to do comparative ballots, is like using the language of the topic. So limit jargon when you're doing comparison between the both sides. I don't say that like we outweigh on like uniqueness or something. No one really knows what that means unless you explain it very well. And a lot of the times it's not explained well because people will substitute jargon for actually explaining arguments. So you want to frame how you're winning the arguments in the scope of the topic, but also the context of the round. So like an example is like, the EU joining the BRI is key to green technology because of whatever warrant you're reading, which is really important for fighting against climate change, which is one of the largest threats facing mankind. So here we're identifying like how you are winning in the context of the resolution, because you're saying the EU joining the BRI, which is part of the resolution, is key to green technology. Then you identify what one of the largest threats to mankind is, which is climate change. So this sort of argumentation, as opposed to saying that we outweigh on uniqueness, is better because it helps link the debate back to the topic and identify important issues the judge should be paying attention to. And it also creates a direct, and then this also can be expanded into comparative analysis, explaining why the other team doesn't link into like, I don't know, green technology and why they don't solve for the problem of climate change as well as you do. The second thing you can do is admit weaknesses and flaws, which doesn't mean that you should be conceding big arguments or like making huge concessions in crossfire. But as I said earlier, you should be acknowledging the reality of what's happening in the round, which means that you are usually not winning everything. And that's something that you should acknowledge in the second half of the round to make the ballot much more realistic for the judge. The next thing is you can recap the argument arc. So basically, like, this is retracing what happened through the round to an argument to make things clearer to the judge. So, like, you can say, we say in case that, like, our argument is blah, 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 like, from case, and then they said this, and then whatever you said in summary to frontline. That helps to increase clarity of what the argument is and how it has changed from the beginning of the round to the judge, which also provides a direct comparative, because it's like, if I can understand what is happening on one side better, I am more likely to vote for them. The next thing is you should build a coherent RFD and final focus. So your judge's RFD ideally should just be like whatever you say in final focus. And this kind of encompasses like giving reasons to criticize the other team, why, but also acknowledging what they're doing well, but also being like, there are still more reasons for, or like, there is still a better reason for you to prefer our ballot over theirs for X, Y, and Z reasons. The other thing is that you should speak about the round in terms of your arguments, not your opponents. So like, you shouldn't always be like, they don't win because. It's more like we win because our argument on their first contention, blah, 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 blah. You never want to be talking about their arguments. You always want to be talking about yours. And then thing that you can really do to improve like this sort of thinking is to practice writing RFDs after a round, because I think that actually judging a round gives you a real perspective on like what it is like to sit and judge, as opposed to what you think it is like to sit and judge from a debating perspective.
So now we're going to talk about the different types of judges that you're probably going to encounter over your debate career. An important thing to remember is that judging is a spectrum. A common misconception that a lot of younger debaters have is that a judge is either super lay or they're like the smartest person alive and they'll make like the flowest decision ever. The thing is, there is an in between, and most judges will actually fall in that in between. So we're gonna start by talking about the lay judges. So a lay judge is usually referred to someone who is unfamiliar with the technical aspect of the activity. A common misconception about them is that they're dumb, and like what Kelly said earlier, it it's super condescending to like they don't like it when you get super condescending and start talking down to them. Treat them like smart people. They're just unfamiliar with the activity. These judges tend to be truth over tech, and what that means is that your argument may be debate true, but they're more likely to vote for an argument that they feel is true in the context of the real world. So lay judges are known to not really flow. They may like take notes on their legal pad, but it's usually like bullet points on big stuff you talk about. It's usually not the line by line that you'd be expecting off of a flow judge or a more experienced judge. And they might vote for things not out of the flow. This happens a lot of the time. They vote off of like crossfire dominance or a concession or something that doesn't really like matter in the context of the flow. Like there have been RFDs like, yeah, they went for 3 arguments in the final focus, they went for one. It's a little unpredictable like that, but once you get more familiar with like the specific judge, you'll be able to adapt better. And these judges usually make up a majority of judging pools at most local tournaments and a lot of national tournaments. So now we're going to talk about how to adapt to the lay judge, and there's a couple things you can do. And the first thing is focusing on more of a narrative debate than a line by line. So lay judges are more receptive to a big picture debate because it relates to them better compared to a line by line where you're talking about like they don't respond to our third front line on their second contention. Like judges don't know what that means, but they do know that they say this, they respond to our argument with this. You should not buy this argument because, and then re-explain the entire narrative of your case in the overarching argument, like what Kelly was talking about a little bit earlier. The second thing you should be doing is explaining your warrant and collapsing. Judges don't want to hear 7 arguments brought up in the final focus, no matter if they're flow or lay, but this is more important on the lay side. If you have, you should be focusing on the biggest issue in the round and really try to condense the round to that. Another thing you should be doing is avoiding jargon. Kelly kind of referred to this earlier. Yeah, my mom does not know what uniqueness controls the direction of the link means. I'm gonna be very honest, I don't know what that means either. You should avoid using jargon like that and just explain what that means in like human terms. Again, like what Kelly was saying earlier, you should be using ballot directed language. What that means is you should be making the round as clean as possible on your end, and in your final focus, you should essentially be writing your judge's RFD for them. They tend to like historical examples a lot more, so they can reference to something when they're hearing your argument. So I would probably use or have 1 or 2 historical examples if you're reading an argument where that applies. A more important thing is really in all rounds, but I feel like it's a lot more important in lay rounds, is just be human. A lot of time in debate, we read these impacts that are like, yeah, 5 million people are going to die. And then you kind of just like blip through that. Um, a lay judge is probably going to think that like, whoa, these people are okay with 5 million people dying. What's wrong with them as people? And a lot of the time that will harm their perception of you. So, for example, I was once part of one round where we read an argument where, like, canceling the Affordable Care Act would kill 38,000 people a year, and the other team was like, "Yeah, you're probably right, but you should weigh our argument of like mutually assured destruction more." And then all 3 judges dropped them because they were like, "Yeah, 38,000 people dying is okay." An important thing to realize is that your performance begins the second you walk in the room and it ends the second you walk out of the room. And what this means is that if you need to seem professional the second you walk in the room, and perceptually, you need to be winning the round the entire time. This means staying confident during the round, not joking around too much before the round, and after the round, not being like, oh man, we lost that, or looking disappointed in your performance. Usually a lay judge will vote off of perception, so you should be trying to win that side of the debate, even if you're not winning like the arguments within the round. So now we're gonna talk about the flow judge, and when I refer to flow judge, I mean like the 100% extreme flow judge, and this usually refers to someone who is familiar with the technical side of the activity. And these people tend to be tech over truth, meaning that the argument doesn't have to be like true in the real world, but in the scope of the debate round, these arguments tend to be true. And what this means is that they'll probably flow everything you say, like outside of Crossfire usually, and use that to use that to make their decision. And usually they don't vote for anything outside of the flow, and you're probably allowed to use speed in front of these judges, unlike a lay judge or the flay judge, which we'll get to in a second. But it really just depends on their paradigm, which we'll also talk about. So when you're trying to adapt to a flow judge, it's important that a lot of flow judges prefer the line by line over a big picture debate or a narrative debate. And because this is true, signposting is going to be especially critical for flow judges, because if they're flowing pretty much everything you're saying on the line by line, they need to know where you are at all times. So signposting is especially critical. The second thing, like Kelly was saying, is comparative weighing. This should probably help you in every round you debate in, but especially in flow judges, a lot of phrases like, even if they win this argument, we can still win this round because of whatever. That will help you a lot. Summary is usually the most important speech in the round, because whatever you say in final focus has to have been in summary before. You can probably get away with it sometimes on the layer or the flay, but on the flow, it's pretty hard to get away with going for something in final focus that wasn't in the summary speech. The same goes for extending offense. Those two kind of go hand in hand. If you don't extend offense in the summary and extend in the final focus, it may work in front of other judges, but usually won't on the flow with the flow judge. So make sure you're extending offense, especially in the summary speech. Call out your opponents for dropping arguments, like what Kelly was talking about earlier. Calling out dropouts, stuff like that, may get a little annoying on the lay, but on the flow, it just helps your judge visualize what's happening on the flow. The most important thing with flow judges is that each one has like little bit of there's a little variation in their preferences. So make sure to read their paradigms. I know we keep talking about it, but we will get to that in a second. So now we're gonna talk about the everyone in between, or the flay judge. And when I say flay, I don't mean like a parent who's been judging for a couple years, even though that does count as a flay judge. I mean everyone who is not either super tech or super lay, and that's pretty much going to be most of your judges. So what's important to realize, like I was talking about earlier, is not every judge will be on the extreme side of the spectrum. And these judges tend to value both tech and truth, depending on where they are in terms of experience and what their personal philosophy on debate is. Sometimes these judges will feel like who they won the debate and not totally off the flow. So what this means is like, if one team read an offensive argument and the other team calls them out for it, or the other team doesn't call them out for it, the judge will sometimes intervene and be like, yeah, this is not okay, and drop them. Whereas technically on the flow, the argument responding to that wasn't made in the round, so it shouldn't be evaluated. A lot of the time, those judges don't really exist. Like, those flow judges don't really exist, but in some cases they do. So adapting to the flay judge, and depending on the type of judge, think of it as winning both the lay and the flow at the same time. And what this means is that perceptually and on the flow, you should be winning the debate. And that should be your goal instead of prioritizing one or the other. Make the signposting as clear as possible, so no matter how well they flow, they know where you are at all times in terms of like their flow. And make sure you're explaining the warrants. Every judge wants to hear why your argument is true and implicate it as to why it matters into the real world. Another thing you should be doing is reading human arguments that your judge can relate to. So what this means is don't read super squirrely or super nebulous arguments that like may not really make a difference in their lives. A lot of the time impacts like lives or climate change are something people can relate to, so they're more likely to vote off of that versus something less relatable, I guess. But like what Kelly was saying before, it's important to read the judge and to make sure and figure out what their preferences are as the round is happening. So, for example, see how they're flowing, see how their body language is in regards to like your debating style, and most importantly, stay confident even if you feel that you're behind, because perception is still a big part of the activity. And even if you're behind in the on the flow, you'll there's still a chance for you to win the round. This is true for a lot of first round judges who may vote off of perception because they're still developing their paradigm. So I would classify a lot of first round judges under the flay judge.
Sorry,
Kelly.
I was muted. Sorry.
Okay.
So now we're going to talk about adapting to panels and what you should do when there are multiple judges of different backgrounds. So the first one is reading paradigms, which we will get to in a little bit, but that's going to be really important. I have seen many rounds when I'm on a panel, and there will be a judge who has a very particular judging philosophy, and the team does not adapt to it, and they automatically lose that judge. So the general theme is that you should be adapting to the lowest common denominator. And what we mean by that is like, if you have a panel of like two lay judges and like a flow judge is not going to drop you for having a more traditional style, but the two lay judges absolutely will if you like don't go slow enough for them to understand what you're saying. So you should always be adapting in a manner that like guarantees that, or not guarantees, but like will gives you a higher chance of winning over most of the judges, but doesn't mean that you will drop one judge. So for instance, if you have one judge that demands a 2-2 split in a rebuttal and the other two don't, the others won't drop you for the split, but the 2-2 judge will drop you if you don't like adequately adapt to his paradigm. So just a lot of the time, this is kind of like thinking of like which judges are like outliers in some cases. Like if there is one judge that requires you to read dates in your cards and you don't read them, you absolutely will lose that judge, but you're not going to lose the other judges. So make sure you're adequately adapting to like what judges want as opposed to like what you, I don't know, like if you traditionally don't read dates and they ask you to, you should definitely do it. Because that gives you a higher chance of winning that judge, but also the rest of the judges because they don't care.
Yeah. An example of never mind. So now we're going to talk about reading a paradigm. We've been talking about this basically the entire lecture, and this is basically going to be the most important thing when you're trying to figure out your judge. If you're judged the paradigm, it will probably tell you what they want you to do in the round, and please just do it. If they want you to read dates, read dates. If they don't want you to read too fast, don't read too fast. If they don't want you to read, I don't know, a specific type of argument, don't read it. It's really that simple, and that'll put you in the best position to win your round, especially if the other team doesn't read the paradigm and you do. So the paradigm will usually tell you what kind of judge you have sitting in the back of the room. Sometimes if they'll just straight up say, yeah, I'm a lay judge, or I've been judging for this many years. You could also see on tab room, you can see their history and see how long they've been judging. So it's just really for you a way for you to look at their paradigms and look at their preferences and see what they want in a round. The way you find a paradigm is on tab. If your tournament's using tab room as their tabulation software, you can click on your judge's name and it should take you to their paradigm if they have one. And if your tournament uses another tab software like Speechwire, Joy of Tournaments, I don't know any others, but if they use another one, you should still go on tabroom.com and click on the paradigm section of it and just search their name just in case they have one. We have it linked in this slideshow, but if you go on tabroom.com, it's on the top right in that little bar, little navigation bar. You should find it right there. Make sure you're reading paradigms before tournaments so you can get a feel for what type of arguments you should be reading. For example, if you have if the tournament is primarily flow, you can read arguments that more technical judges will like, or if it's a primarily lay tournament, then you would read more human arguments. A good activity for this, or a good drill, I guess, is going to national tournaments in the past around the country and clicking on their judges and just reading all the paradigms. So that way you can get a feel for what kind of judges what. So now we're going to talk about what kind of questions you should be asking before a round. And this is specific to whether a judge either has a paradigm but doesn't mention what you're asking about, or if they just don't have a paradigm at all. So questions you should be asking are like, do you have any topic specific preferences? So like sometimes judges have arguments they don't want to hear on a topic, or they don't want to hear like the acronyms. For example, I know in my paradigm for this upcoming topic, I don't know what any I do know what the BRI is, but I don't know what a lot of the other things are. Last year I didn't know what the EEZ was until like a month and a half into the topic.
Me too.
Yeah, it was hard.
It's really bad.
That should tell you what they would look for on the topic. Another question is, are you okay with speed? If they're not, then you know you need to start slowing your arguments down, and maybe an indicator this judge is more on the lay side. And the third thing is, do you require the blank speech to do blank? So what I'm asking basically is, or what I'm saying basically is, don't ask for all of their preferences. Ask specific questions that you feel that affect you. So questions you should not be asking is, the first one is, what should I do to get a 30 in the round? I promise you as a judge, this is really annoying because we honestly don't know the answer to this. Just debate well and adapt to the paradigm and you should get a 30, or at least high enough speaks. The second question that I find pretty annoying and a lot of judges do is, do you have any preferences or paradigms? First and foremost, you should be checking tab room to see if they have one. If they don't, you should also not be asking this question. You should be asking specific questions like I was saying earlier. And the third question that can be kind of annoying is, are you going to flow this debate? You're obviously going to find out in like 5 minutes when you read your case. So be patient and you'll find out. And on that note, I think we're done.
Oh, okay. If you guys want like practice for judge adaptation, you can always read paradigms and then like give speeches as if you were adapting to that paradigm. But also, if you were like struggling with lay appeal, I find that like talking to your parents about what your arguments are or like debating in front of them is very helpful, because chances are your parents are very similar to the typical lay judge you will get. But other than that, I think that overall your style should probably not change that much between round to round, because you should always be communicating in a manner that is like, understandable, and maybe your speed changes between round to round, but I think that's about it.
Yeah. For
Yeah.
practice with flay judges, a lot of times you could practice in front of like your teachers.
Oh yeah.
Talk to your teachers about arguments, because sometimes like if it's like a foreign policy topic, your social studies teacher might know something. And yeah.
Yeah. If you guys have any questions, let us know. You can message us on Facebook or on Slack if you're in the workshop. But thanks for watching our lecture.
Yep.
Bye.
Have a good day.